Alexa, stop. Alexa, stop. Hey guys, it's Rebecca. So today I'm going to be doing my top 10 favourite books from 2020. So just talking about all of the books that I liked the most. I really didn't read that many books, but I couldn't pick like a top 5. I'm only doing 5 for like the worst books, and even some of those, like, I don't even consider them like necessarily bad books. They're just my lowest rated. So I'm just gonna get talking about the books because I don't really need a disclaimer for me talking about ones that I do like. So in no particular order, I'm just going to be going through 10 books that I really enjoyed this year. And the first one that I'd like to talk about, which isn't actually a book really necessarily, it's a play, but that is Hamlet by Shakespeare. I absolutely love this play, and I ended up doing an essay on it and ended up making me decide to actually do my dissertation most likely on Hamlet. I'm just so excited about this. I just love it so much. For some reason I just never read it, even though it's obviously one of the most popular Shakespeare plays. I just hadn't read it before. Basically, if you don't know, this is one of Shakespeare's most popular tragedies. It follows Hamlet, whose father, who was the king of Denmark actually, he had recently passed away, and Hamlet, the main character, he suspects his uncle of having killed his father because his mother ends up marrying his uncle 2 months after his own father had died. Hamlet is not happy about this, and obviously it's just the classic tragedy. It's Hamlet's descent into Elizabethan madness and just his tragic fall. But what I love about it so much is that we really see the consequences of grief. I think that's what's most interesting for me in here, and I think that that's what really set it apart from other tragedies that, although I do love, this just became one of my top 2 favourites along with King Lear. I don't think anything could ever beat King Lear. I think it's amazing, but this definitely made it to my top 10 list of 2020, even though it is a play and it's kind of cheating, but I absolutely love this and I gave it 5 stars, and I really don't think it's that difficult to understand. So if you're trying to get into Shakespeare, I think that this is a really nice place to start with. So the next books I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to put these into a series, and that is the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J Maas. So I've only read up to, I forget what they're called, I've only read up to Queen of Shadows, so I need to continue on to Empire of Storms, which is the one I haven't read yet. But from Throne of Glass all the way through to Queen of Shadows, I absolutely love these. I know a lot of people like will say Sarah J Maas is trash and it's not good fantasy and everything like that, but I really enjoyed it, and I actually find a lot of other tragedy, not tragedy, a lot of other fantasy much worse than these, and I actually think Sarah J Maas is an extremely good YA writer. I think that sometimes there's only so much room that YA authors actually have when writing in like the YA age genre, and I think that she did a really good job of making these books something that I can see all age ranges like being able to enjoy. Obviously not younger like children, but I definitely think from YA upwards, I think that these could be books that would be really important, like, and could really get people into reading fantasy. And these were some of the first fantasy books that I genuinely really enjoyed in so long, especially YA fantasy, and I just can see the hype. I can see why so many people love her and even consider her a guilty pleasure, because she's so much fun to read, and I just can't wait to continue on to Empire of Storms, and I can't wait to get to ACOTAR because I still haven't read it, so I'm so behind on the hype with that. But I love these so far anyway. I forgot to say that I'm pretty sure that I rated this one Throne of Glass 4 stars. I think I rated Heir of Fire 5 stars and Crown of Midnight I think 5 stars, and then Queen of Shadows 4 stars. I think that that's what I did. I should have double checked this, but yeah, I do love these books so much. I think they're so much fun. So the next book actually might be my top favourite book of 2020 because it absolutely blew me away, and that is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I don't really see this talked about on BookTube that much, which is really surprising considering it was like the Waterstones book of the year, and maybe it's because I don't watch a lot of BookTube to talk about literary fiction. I found out about this actually because of Jasmine over at Jasmine Reads. I'll leave her channel below. I did talk about this recently because I finished this I think in December. It's honestly amazing. Just to give a quick synopsis, it basically follows multiple people who would have been in Shakespeare's life. The main focus and the main plot is around Shakespeare's 11-year-old son who sadly passed away. It's not exactly a spoiler. We all know that Hamlet died. We all know that, you know, Hamlet was most likely written because of Hamlet, and Hamlet was written 4 years later after Hamlet, Shakespeare's twin son, passed away, and it's an extremely sad story. But the fact that we know in advance that Hamlet does pass away, it doesn't take away from any of the heartbreaking writing that Maggie O'Farrell manages to write. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I feel like I don't have eloquent enough words to describe how amazing this book is. I cried my eyes out. It actually took me months to read because, well, first of all, I didn't want it to end, and I didn't want to read it because it was so sad. But I think the best way to go about this is actually just to read it in one sitting. I think it would be even more impactful that way. So I think I did take away of some enjoyment. So I can't even believe what it must be like to read in one go, because it's absolutely amazing. But definitely trigger warnings for grief, because the way the grief is talked about is extremely well done but extremely upsetting. So if you find that you might not be able to read about something like that, I definitely want to say that there is a trigger warning for this. But if you can, I definitely highly recommend this one. Even if you're not into literary fiction, it's still a very easy but beautiful read, and I think it could be read by people who like any age genre or any kind of topical genre. I think it's absolutely amazing. Please go and read this one. So the next ones I don't actually physically have with me, but the next one I want to talk about is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Obviously this is on so many people's lists, but I think it's definitely worth the mention. I just really enjoyed it. I don't think it's the most beautifully written or anything like that. I think it's just well written. Like, this book is just, you just want to keep reading. I think that's what the really good thing about this book is. I think what I was expecting was this really kind of flowery, kind of over the top writing, but that's definitely not what's in that book. I think it's just, I wasn't expecting it to go the way that it did. I'm not talking about the very end, but I think bits and pieces throughout. I don't think the end was necessarily that shocking. I think that it was kind of like, oh, but it's what happens throughout the story that I think it really keeps you intrigued. And I think that that's what makes that book so good, because I feel like that hardly ever happens for me. I'm always kind of like, yeah, this is good, but I don't get that, oh my god, I need to see what happens. I very rarely get that feeling. So Taylor Jenkins Reid does an absolutely amazing job in that book, and I can 100% see why people love this book, and I definitely think it's worth the hype. Not that if I didn't think it was, it wouldn't be, but I completely agree, and I can completely see where everybody's coming from, which is a really nice feeling. And I'm glad that I wasn't like the odd one out who didn't enjoy it. Like, I absolutely love it, and yeah, I just think it deserves all of the attention and love that it's getting. So the next book that I want to talk about is actually a non-fiction, and again, this one I actually have on Kindle, and I actually had to read this for a unit that I'm doing at university called Decolonizing Literature, and that is Always Another Country by Sosonke Msimang. I thought this book was amazing. Basically what it is, it's about the difficulties of growing up in apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa, and Sosonke, she actually moves around different countries, and it's kind of about her experience in different African countries and different places in the world, such as she moves to Canada and stuff like that, and the racism that she experiences. Despite being a black South African woman, she experiences racism no matter where she goes. I think that that's so intriguing to read about, because not only is it real, and it's this woman's real true experience of what it was like and all of these things that happened to her, but it's also her moving around to different places in Africa, which I think is very rarely a topic in at least books that I read. I think that this was really good for me to read. It helped me to understand a lot of South African history a lot more than I previously did, and whenever Sosonke moves to Canada, it's really interesting and heartbreaking to see what she experiences, but it's interesting because it's real life, and I feel like it's so educational, and I would highly recommend people to go and read this. And also there are trigger warnings in this book for experiences of racism, experiences of abuse. There's a lot of mention of mental illness. This is actually why I gave this book 4 stars, is because I feel like there were some instances where thoughts of suicide and things weren't dealt the way that they could have been, or as well or as sensitively as they could have, because basically it goes through Sosonke's experience in an abusive relationship, and the person that she was with had bipolar disorder. Although in the book you're obviously like rooting for her, and you can see like the horrible things that he does to her, and you know, the abusive behaviours that he does towards her. It's obviously sickening, but there are moments where she's not very sensitive to mental illness and suicidal behaviours or suicidal thoughts. So I definitely want to point that out, that that's what I didn't like, but it was unlike anything I'd ever read before, and I think partially that's my fault because I very rarely read non-fiction, but it reads like a fictional book. I kept forgetting that it wasn't real because it reads like fiction, it reads like a story. It's a beautiful novel, and I think it just really highlights the realities of what it would have been like to grow up as a South African black woman during apartheid. It's honestly amazing, and I think that everybody should go and read it. I think it's an absolutely fantastic book, and I haven't really heard it talked about at all on BookTube. So the next book I'm going to talk about I actually do have a physical copy of, but it's in my student house in Bristol right now, so I don't actually have it. That is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. So this book is definitely one that has some controversial things in it. I did a vlog where I actually read that book and I talk a lot more in detail about why that is, so I can link that above. The reason why I love that book is I just think it's absolutely incredibly written. There's definitely some horrible things, and N-word is used a couple of times throughout the book, and a white woman did write this book. I think it was during like early Victorian times. There are also a lot of things that make this book incredibly important because of its place in history. I also think it's extremely well written, and I think that it deals with things extremely well considering what time it was written in. It's not like this book was written within the last 10 to 20 years. Like, this book is hundreds of years old and was way ahead of its time. I didn't give this book 5 stars because couldn't justify giving it 5 stars because there are a couple of times not only does it get kind of boring and repetitive, and I feel like Little Eva and stuff, she can be quite repetitive and a bit unrealistic, and I think that a lot of it is unrealistic, but I think just tried to contextualize that book and ended up really loving it. I had a really good time reading it, and as I said, it's so historically important because it deals with slavery in America. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was one of the first women to write without a pseudonym. Yeah, I just think that it's a fantastic book for multiple reasons, and yeah, I'll leave my vlog above. Hopefully that made sense. So the next book that actually managed to make it into my top 10 is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. Again, my copy of this is in Bristol. This book definitely has trigger warnings for abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental illness, suicidal behaviours. I basically think just full stop, if you're not in a very good state of mind, I just wouldn't read this book. If you're kind of struggling with your mental health, I definitely wouldn't advise this book, but I think if you're in kind of a good enough mind place, then I would definitely recommend this book because it's, even though it is dark, it's a very easy read because it's intriguing. So it does read and is paced like a thriller, so that's why it's really easy to get through. I loved this book. I didn't give it 5 stars because I do think some of the writing especially near the beginning, is quite cringy. Despite that, I think that book is amazing, and I think it's an extremely important book because it really shows how the lines can be blurred at times when dealing with abuse, how the lines can be blurred between love and the feeling of being abused. In the book, Vanessa was 15 years old and she was abused by her English teacher, and it just shows how her love for him was completely abused, but also to what extent was it really love, because obviously he was abusing her, and it just really shows that, and it shows how growing up she didn't even realise that she was even being abused. But anyway, I really love this book. I definitely, as I said, I definitely think it's an important book, and if you can, I would definitely recommend going and getting this one and reading it. So the next book, again, both of my copies are actually in Bristol right now. This is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. Originally I'd given this one 4 stars, but it lived in my head rent free since I read it, like genuinely for some reason. I always considered To the Lighthouse my favourite book of hers. I've only read 2, but I preferred To the Lighthouse, but I've realised that I've completely forgotten the majority of what happens in To the Lighthouse, not being able to stop thinking about Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway is about multiple things. I don't know if it really has that much of a plot. It basically follows multiple plots because obviously Virginia Woolf was one of the first modernists, and she was one of the first people to actually start writing third person multiple point of views where we head hop without warning. Basically follows this woman called Mrs. Dalloway, and she is a middle to upper class woman who really likes to throw parties, really grand not as far as Gatsby style, but nearly to that level. Gatsby style parties. It's during that kind of time period. It's such a grand book. I don't know how else to describe it. I think it's, for me, it's what I wish Gatsby was. It talks a lot about mental illness. We see a lot about Virginia Woolf's own mental illness portrayed through her characters. There is trigger warnings therefore for mental illness. There's massive trigger warnings for suicide. But it talks a lot about classism and like getting help for your mental health, especially during that time, how you're basically kind of told to have a cup of tea and kind of go out to the countryside, and it's the same now really a lot of the time, but I think that that's kind of worrying that it hasn't changed that much at all. But it really shows how the characters who are mentally ill in the story are often not taken seriously by these doctors. But then we also follow Mrs. Dalloway, who's having these grand parties, and all that's important to her is throwing these parties. But we are also following somebody who suffered quite severely from bipolar disorder. I can't remember what I was talking about. My camera overheated again because I keep rambling over and over again. But yeah, I think I was talking about Mrs. Dalloway, but whatever. I'll just continue on to the last book actually. And the last book that I'm going to talk about is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I reread this year, I mean in 2020, so last year. I just thought this needs to go on the list because it was better than most things else I read. It was better than Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, even though I did like that. It was still better, so I gave it 5 stars again on my reread, and it's just amazing to get to reread it. I read this one to my younger brother and it was so exciting to see his reaction. We're now reading Catching Fire, and yeah, it was just so cute to see his reaction. It made me so happy. I just loved reading it, you know. I don't have to talk about what the Hunger Games are about or anything, I know, but I just absolutely loved it. I thought it was so much fun. That's all of the books that I wanted to talk about today. I hope a lot of this made sense. It probably didn't make sense. It was probably just me rambling. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you would like to, then I would really appreciate it if you did subscribe and hit the like button, and comment below what your favourite reads of 2020 were, and tell me if you've read any of these, or if you want to read any of these, or if you hated any of these, because I love to have a discussion with you. Comments are always my favourite thing, but I would love if you did subscribe. I would love if you could hit the like button and hit the notification bell so that you can be notified when I upload, because that'll really help the algorithm and everything. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.